From New York, this is Democracy Now!
The president must be held accountable. No one is above the law.
Look, it's just a continuation of the witch hunt. It's the worst witch hunt in political history.
As the House Intelligence Committee holds the first televised hearing in its impeachment investigation of President Trump, we speak to the legendary broadcaster Bill Moyers, who covered the Nixon and Clinton impeachment proceedings.
Nixon's impeachment process revealed important evidence as it went along. We probably would never have known about the hidden tapes that Nixon had made during the White House had it not been for the impeachment process. So watch for the evidence that is introduced, particularly on this first morning.
Then we look at the political crisis in Bolivia after President Evo Morales resigned following what he described as a coup. Morales is now in Mexico, where he's received political asylum.
I also want to tell you, brothers and sisters, as long as I am alive, we will stay in politics. As long as I am alive, the fight will continue, and we're sure that the people of the world have all the rights to free themselves.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Televised impeachment hearings begin today in the inquiry into whether President Trump withheld military aid from Ukraine to pressure the Ukrainian president to investigate Trump's political rival Joe Biden and his son. Two witnesses are testifying today before the House Intelligence Committee: George Kent, a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, and William Taylor, a former ambassador and the top U.S. diplomat in Ukraine. Both officials have privately told congressional investigators Trump withheld aid to Ukraine in an attempt to pressure Ukraine to investigate the Bidens. In now-released text messages, Bill Taylor texted Gordon Sondland, the U.S. ambassador to the European Union, the wealthy hotel magnate, quote, "Are we now saying security assistance and White House meeting are conditioned on investigations?" Sondland texted back, "Call me," perhaps not wanting to leave a paper trail. Today marks only the third televised impeachment hearings in U.S. history. We'll have more on today's historic hearings after headlines with the legendary journalist Bill Moyers, who covered the Nixon and Clinton impeachment hearings. In Bolivia, right-wing Senator Jeanine Áñez declared herself president Tuesday night despite a lack of quorum in Congress. The same day, longtime Bolivian President Evo Morales landed in Mexico, where he's received asylum. This is Jeanine Áñez.
As President of the Chamber of Senators, I immediately assume the presidency of the state as foreseen in the constitutional order, and I commit myself to accept responsibility for all necessary measures to pacify the country.
Evo Morales' movement towards socialism, or MAS party, is refusing to recognize Áñez as president, calling her claim illegal, decrying Morales' resignation over the weekend as a military coup. On Tuesday, the Organization of American States held an emergency meeting in Washington, D.C., where U.S. Ambassador Carlos Trujillo read a statement from President Donald Trump applauding Evo Morales' resignation, warning it should, quote, send a strong signal to Venezuela, Nicaragua, Mexico, Uruguay, Nicaragua, and the president-elect of Argentina have all denounced Morales' departure as a military coup. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan is visiting President Trump at the White House today and will hold a news conference with him this afternoon. The visit comes amidst international condemnation of the recent Turkish offensive into northern Syria, which Turkey launched after President Trump abruptly withdrew U.S. troops from the area, clearing the way for the offensive. U.S. military officials told CNN Tuesday the Pentagon has a drone surveillance video showing a possible war crime being carried out by Turkish-commanded fighters in Syria. Last week, former National Security Advisor John Bolton surprised a Miami gathering of hedge fund managers when he said he thought Trump's decisions on Turkey are motivated by personal relationships or financial interests. The New York Times reports 3 sons-in-law play key roles in the U.S.-Turkey relationship. The son-in-law of President Erdogan, who's Turkey's finance minister, the son-in-law of a Turkish tycoon who became a business partner to the Trump Organization, and the son-in-law of President Trump, his senior advisor Jared Kushner, who oversees much of U.S. foreign policy. The Supreme Court heard oral arguments over lawsuits demanding the Trump administration preserve DACA, that's Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, the Obama-era program that grants protection from deportation and a work permit to at least 700,000 undocumented people brought to the United States as children. The New York Times reports the court's conservative majority appears poised to side with President Trump in ending the program, while some of the court's liberal justices seem skeptical of Trump's efforts. Justice Sonia Sotomayor said on Tuesday the termination of DACA, quote, is not about the law. This is about our choice to destroy lives, she said. The Supreme Court also heard oral arguments Tuesday in the case of slain Mexican teenager Sergio Adrian Hernandez Guerrica, who was shot in the face and killed in 2010 as he played in Ciudad Juarez by a Border Patrol agent who stood across the border in El Paso, Texas. During arguments, liberal judges expressed concerns over providing no legal relief to the families of people who've been killed in cross-border shootings by U.S. agents, essentially allowing federal officers on American soil to act unlawfully with impunity. But conservative justices reportedly seem to side with the Trump administration, with Justice Brett Kavanaugh emerging as a potential decisive vote. The Supreme Court also declined to hear an appeal by gun manufacturer Remington Arms Tuesday, clearing the way for the families of the 26 victims of the 2012 Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting in Newton, Connecticut, to sue the firearm manufacturer. The families are arguing Remington violated Connecticut law when it marketed the Bushmaster rifle for assaults against human beings. The Supreme Court's decision not to take up the case let stand the Connecticut Supreme Court's decision to allow the Newtown family's lawsuit to move forward. And in more legal news, a federal court in Boston has ruled U.S. authorities' warrantless searches of people's phones and computers at airports and other U.S. ports of entry violates the Fourth Amendment. The American Civil Liberties Union and Electronic Frontier Foundation, which filed the suit, celebrated the ruling as a victory for privacy rights. In more privacy news, the Health and Human Services Department has opened a federal inquiry into Google's Project Nightingale program, which seeks to collect health data on millions of Americans. Project Nightingale is a collaboration between Google and Ascension, the second largest healthcare provider in the United States. In a video posted online, a whistleblower who works with the program says the cache of medical data includes the full names and medical details of millions of Americans. Newly released government data shows the U.S. government has detained a record number of migrant children over the past year, nearly 70,000 babies, children, and teenagers held in U.S. government custody. That's a 42% increase over the last fiscal year. The American Academy of Pediatrics has condemned child detention, saying even short periods of detention can cause psychological trauma and long-term mental health risks. The Southern Poverty Law Center says White House senior advisor Stephen Miller sought to promote white nationalism, far-right extremist ideas, and racist immigration stories through the right-wing website Breitbart in the lead-up to the 2016 election. That's according to a cache of leaked emails that Miller sent to a Breitbart writer in 2015 and 2016. On Tuesday, New York Congressmember Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez called for Miller to resign. In Afghanistan, officials say at least 7 civilians were killed in a car bombing in the capital, Kabul. No one has claimed responsibility for the attack. It comes after the Afghan government and the Taliban reached a prisoner exchange deal, which could lead to the release of an American professor who was kidnapped in Kabul in 2016. Major protests in Hong Kong are continuing to escalate for a third straight day today, including clashes between pro-democracy students and police at the Chinese University of Hong Kong.
We have not succeeded with our 5 demands since the movement began in June, and more have been added, including reforming the police force. We will not give up until justice is served.
That was one of the thousands of protesters out on the streets of Hong Kong Tuesday. The Chinese Foreign Ministry says it stands by the Hong Kong police, who are accused of escalating violence against protesters.
The Central Chinese government firmly supports the government of the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region. Police and judiciary authorities taking effective measures to severely punish illegal criminal activities, protect the safety of Hong Kong residents and their property, and restore peace and stability in Hong Kong.
In Chile, protesters led a massive national strike Tuesday as they condemned the government's plans to rewrite the country's constitution, which dates back to Augusto Pinochet's military regime. Chile's interior minister announced Sunday the government would draft a new constitution, which Congress would then rewrite and put to a public referendum. But protesters say the people should be involved with the rewriting process from the beginning, and that this is an attempt by Sebastián Piñera's government to delay political and social reforms in Chile. In Michigan, former McDonald's worker Jenna Reese is suing the fast food chain over sexual harassment. She says she and other female McDonald's workers were groped, assaulted, and verbally harassed by one of their co-workers, and that the general manager ignored the abuse. The lawsuit comes 1 week after McDonald's former CEO, Steve Easterbrook, was fired for having a sexual relationship with an employee. In Connecticut, longtime U.S. resident Salma Sikandar has won asylum months after her husband led a hunger strike in front of ICE, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Office in Hartford, Connecticut, to protest her deportation. Sikandar has lived in the United States for nearly 20 years, but in June she was abruptly told by ICE that she had to leave the country by August. This is Sikandar's son, Samir Mahmood, explaining how his father decided to launch the hunger strike.
So what happened was my dad had a bunch of crazy ideas because he was losing his mind, to be honest, because of the deportation. He was going to lose the love of his life, and he's going to lose my mother. So he thought of having a hunger strike in front of Hartford, in front of ICE's building, where if they look out the window, they see us for the next 43 hours until the deportation date/time. And so the hunger strike was led in front of ICE. There were about 9 other individuals who joined, and over hundreds of people have joined us, from the South Windsor mayor to the Manchester mayor.
To see our full interview with Salma Sikandar and Samir Mahmood, go to DemocracyNow.org. An American author and historian, Noel Ignatieff, has died at the age of 78. He was the co-founder of the New Abolitionist Society and co-editor of the journal Race Trader, whose slogan was, "Treason to whiteness is loyalty to humanity." Noel Ignatieff spent decades theorizing about white privilege and calling for the abolition of whiteness, saying, quote, "The white race consists of those who partake of the privileges of white skin." He was also the author of the book, How the Irish Became White. He died on Saturday at his home in Tucson, Arizona. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world. Televised impeachment hearings begin today in the inquiry into whether President Trump withheld military aid from Ukraine to pressure the Ukrainian president to investigate his political rival Joe Biden and his son. 2 witnesses are testifying today before the House Intelligence Committee: George Kent, a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, and William Taylor, a former ambassador and the top U.S. diplomat in Ukraine. Both officials have privately told congressional investigators that Trump withheld aid to Ukraine in an attempt to pressure the government to investigate the Bidens. Taylor confirmed there was a quid pro quo. Donald Trump is just the 4th U.S. president to face an impeachment inquiry. Bill Clinton was impeached in 1998. Andrew Johnson was impeached in 1868. Richard Nixon resigned in 1974 prior to an impeachment vote.
Today, we're joined by the legendary journalist Bill Moyers, who covered the Nixon and Clinton impeachment hearings. In the 1960s, Bill Moyers was a founding organizer of the Peace Corps. He served as press secretary for President Lyndon Johnson. In 1971, he began an award-winning career as a television broadcaster on PBS, as well as on CBS and other networks. Moyers has received 37 Emmys, 9 Peabodys, and countless other prizes. He was elected to the Television Hall of Fame in 1995. Last week, Bill Moyers took out a full-page ad in the New York Times urging PBS to broadcast the impeachment hearings live and to rerun them in prime time. Bill Moyers, welcome back to Democracy Now!
Good to see you again, Amy, and Juan, thank you for having me. And I don't know what this legendary means, except does it mean I'm past tense?
You're right here. You're very current and now talking about the future. And thank you so much for that, Bill. Talk about this full-page ad that you took out and what you're calling for.
We're calling for PBS, our friends and colleagues there, to put the hearings on, which they will carry live in the afternoons when they happen, along with CBS, NBC, and other networks, but to put them live as they did with Watergate in prime time, 8 o'clock at night, so people who have worked all day can come home and watch what they missed. Now, my friends at PBS, some of them say to me, well, people can find it. It's on this cable channel. It's on that satellite channel. It's on the internet. But that's different from having to look for it in the wild west of the modern media universe, from being able to see it simply, easily, right there in your living room. And many Americans still get their television the old-fashioned way, from the set in the evening. Prime time is still our public square. And for PBS to repeat the hearings in prime time gives the many millions more people the chance to see it collectively, in a sense, and see what's happening, hear what's happening, and make up their own minds.
And Bill, you were obviously front and center during the Watergate hearings. Talk about the impact of those televised debates on what people thought about Watergate and about President Nixon.
Actually, our two main anchors at that time at PBS, Robert McNeil and Jim Lehrer, were front and center. I did peripheral coverage, and then I did a documentary that summed it all up called Essay on Watergate. What those hearings did was to give millions of Americans the chance to hear the evidence as it unfolded, to test for themselves the credibility of the witnesses, whether they could seem believable or not. PBS was new then. It was a rookie network. Not many people were taking it seriously, and all of a sudden we were the only network in prime time public service that were giving these hearings full exposure with very effective moderation by Jim and Robin, and they didn't get in the way of the testimony. They were not pundits. They were guiding the viewers through it. And as a result, millions of Americans got to see for themselves democracy on trial, how it was handled. It was a more sedate era in Congress then than it is now. It was before Gingrich, who unleashed the forces of wrath when he was Speaker of the House. And people were polite, but they asked serious questions. They developed their stories. And the result was, at the end, Americans felt they had a sense of what it was all about. Nixon, I think, would have been impeached. But before that happened, several Republicans, it was a different Republican Party then, went down to the White House and said, you've got to go. It was those hearings that showed Americans how the process worked. Was the evidence believable? And actually, it was during those hearings that testimony came out about the hidden tapes that Nixon had made of every conversation he had in the White House. From there, they went and found the tape that proved to be the incriminating, indefensible evidence that Nixon had told the FBI to keep the CIA from investigating the charges against him.
And when you talk about punditry, one of the important roles of public broadcasting is precisely not only that, as you say, that the commentators generally take a backseat and let the actual events unfold of themselves rather than constantly commenting. But also, there are no commercial interruptions. I mean, the whole idea that you're in a serious public hearing and then whether it's CNN or Fox or ABC, they have to break to commercials and decide what part of the testimony not to cover. It really does have an impact on how people digest the information, doesn't it?
Yes, we slice and dice the news today. All of us do. A bit here, a bit there, an episode here, an episode there. And it's kind of a daily coverage. It's hard to get the main story of the big event that's going on. You know, I have many friends, and we all three of us have many friends in commercial television, but commercial networks have made their peace with the little lies and merchandising of our economic system. I mean, that's how they make their living. PBS was intended not to be a commercial enterprise, but to be a public service supported by the public, as we are. In fact, we all pay a little bit in taxes to keep PBS on the air. And that makes a difference. If you can read or see a story without a constant interruption, without somebody else's voice getting inside your ear and beginning to interfere with your story, it's a different experience.
And it's free over the airwaves. That's a big difference.
That's the big thing. It's where everybody can come home and without having paid a cable fee or a streaming fee, you can see it right there in your living room.
Let's talk about the difference between the coverage of the Nixon impeachment hearings and what we're seeing today. How do you think the coverage of the impeachment inquiry into Donald Trump on this first day, as we lead into the public part of the inquiry, is happening?
Well, as the New York Times said yesterday, the Watergate hearings took place in a more, as I said earlier, a sedate environment. I mean, the Republicans and Democrats were much more civil to each other than they are in Congress now. That was more a civic education than it was a food fight. The Clinton impeachment became a food fight. That was the turn in our history when the ability of the two parties to seriously explore an issue together dissolved into conflict and accusations and what we see today. But they were able in those days to let the evidence come out slowly. I think it was 51 nights and days that PBS carried the hearings then. Today, as we know, it will be a circus. I mean, there will be efforts to try it, and the Democrats tried it in the Clinton impeachment trials. They tried to keep interrupting the Republicans and prevent them from making their case against Bill Clinton. That, of course, is going to happen in these hearings.
I want to go back to Richard Nixon addressing the country in the face of the growing threat of impeachment.
People have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
After 2 years of denials and under growing pressure, Nixon left the White House on August 9, 1974. He resigned, becoming the only U.S. president ever to resign from office.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
You are here to say goodbye to us, and we don't have a good word for it in English. The best is au revoir. We'll see you again.
Richard Nixon, Bill Moyers, you remember that moment well.
We did see him again, too, because he was resurrected after his political death, and there he was making speeches, writing books and all that. Yes, I watched that moment and wasn't surprised because I had watched the Watergate hearings all the time, and the evidence was, as I said earlier, indefensible. You couldn't undermine that evidence. And there were so many serious constitutional charges against Nixon that the country took it much more seriously than they did the Clinton impeachment.
Well, I mean, there was this seminal moment in the summer of 1973 when Tennessee Republican Senator Fred Harris, people may know him more as the Law and Order DA from television, asked Alexander Butterfield about the existence of any recording system. Butterfield pauses, then details the system for about an hour non-stop. He was only called, he only knew he had 3 hours before, I think, to testify. He didn't have a lawyer with him. He didn't consult with a lawyer. If he did, he might never have revealed this. But talk about that moment.
Well, Alexander Butterfield was an honorable man, and there were many honorable Republicans in that time who decided they had to really be honest with the American people. And when he disclosed that there was this tape, that these tapes existed, and Nixon was on the record so that the members of the Congress and the public could actually hear what he was saying, it was almost like a great sucking in of the breath of the hearings and of Americans. They suddenly knew. They didn't have to take somebody else's word for it. They could listen to Richard Nixon, and you would just realize this was going to take a significant turn, a dramatic turn.
Did you ever meet Butterfield?
I did meet Butterfield many years later.
He ran the security system at the White House.
Yes, he was the equivalent of, LBJ had his own Alexander Butterfield, but he didn't have as many recordings as Nixon did. Yes, you could almost look at that face again of Alexander Butterfield, making sure he was going to do it and determining to do it and then doing it. I mean, in television, it makes us intimate strangers. That moment made Butterfield an intimate ally of everybody who believed the Constitution was in danger. And it's a memorable moment in American history.
Do you think there's a recording of the Trump phone call?
Well, I have wondered that, not because I know anything, but just watching the pattern of the Nixon hearings and what brought him down finally. I think there could well be a recording of that phone call. I happen to know that, most of Lyndon Johnson's phone calls, important ones, were recorded. Nixon recorded apparently many more than LBJ did. And I'm sure that the security people in the White House have something more telling than we have seen so far, because everything we've seen has had ellipses in it, the transcripts of that phone call, and people have talked around it. But somewhere buried in the White House may well be a recording that, as with the Nixon tapes, we had to go to the court. The Congress had to go to court to get the Supreme Court to rule yes or no on whether those tapes could be made, that tape that Butterfield was talking about could be made public. Congress ruled for the public and for Congress. We could come down to that in this if somebody reveals in the course of the next few days that, yes, there is a tape of the recording between President Trump and the president of Ukraine.
We're speaking with legendary broadcaster, journalist, president of the Schumann Media Center, Bill Moyers. Stay with us.
And so I came to see him to listen for a while. And there he was, this young boy, a stranger to my eyes, strumming my bass with his fingers, singing my life with his words, killing me softly with his song, killing me softly with his song.
Killing Me Softly by Roberta Flack. It was one of the top hits back in 1973 in the midst of the, impeachment inquiry into Richard Nixon. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Our guest is the legendary broadcaster, Bill Moyers. Juan?
Bill, I wanted to ask you again about the Watergate hearings. John Dean's testimony as one of the inner circles of the president at the time, the impact that had on the public, and also the fact that in today's situation, President Trump is doing everything possible to prevent any of his inner circle from being able to testify before Congress. In essence, running out the clock on this impeachment process, hoping that there won't be time for the Congress to have the hearings with his people if a court decision has to be made about his inner circle being able to testify.
Exactly. But in those days, they didn't have that defense. And so one witness after another, everybody alive today can remember when John Dean said, "What did you tell the president?" "I told the president there was a cancer on the presidency." And again, you could hear a kind of unanimous gasp in the hearings and around the country. You knew from that we were on to something different from, President Johnson in 1866 was impeached. 68 because he had fired the Secretary of War, Stanton. That was the charge against him. This was not a cancer on the presidency. Suddenly you realized there was something metastasizing politically that we had better pay attention to. And John Dean again realized that this was telling the truth now was the only way out of a hole into which the White House had dug itself.
And in some of your statements recently, you've been talking about the importance that of the so many lies that we've been exposed to are actually undermining our democracy. Could you expand on that as well?
All presidents lie. They do so tactically. They do so strategically. Franklin Roosevelt lied about Lend-Lease until he could convince the public to go along with it. All presidents lie. It's a defense they use. But not all presidents lie systemically. Not all presidents lie constantly. And the fact of the matter is, and it's not just the president, not just the White House lies that are filling the atmosphere with this toxic poison that my good friend and colleague Eric Alterman, a very distinguished journalist and professor here of journalism in town, has written about the lies of presidents. There's a wonderful documentary called "All Governments Lie," and they do. But what we have now is a culture of lying, not only from within politics, but from within media that is determined only to protect and save the President of the United States, Donald Trump,
and lying about things big and small.
Yes, exactly. And you don't know what to believe anymore. I still believe that facts matter. But they're trying to change the facts on us. And that's where a few journalists and a few media outlets have a real role to play. It's to always put on the table the evidence against the lies that are being told by the people who have a vested interest in lying.
So what kind of response have you gotten to your full-page ad in the New York Times calling for the airing of these hearings not only live but in prime time, and the significance of PBS? Interestingly, back in Nixon time, Nixon wanted to get rid of PBS.
His special assistant, Pat Buchanan, later the candidate for president and formidable right-wing champion, said, yes, let's just defund it. Let's just got to get rid of it, not fund it. And here, in those days, PBS bravely stood up and said, we're going to carry the hearing. Now, they were nervous because the right wing was already taking PBS on. Nixon wanted it eliminated. They were harassing, trying to intimidate. But and so they asked the stations, what do you think? And only 52% of the stations, just a little over half, said, let's carry the hearings. They did. I think later everyone claimed credit for having carried the hearings. But PBS did its role then as a public educator. You know, impeachment proceedings are a civic education. We rarely get to see democracy on trial. We rarely know what's really happening in government. So much more is happening than we know. And when you have an impeachment hearing, only 4 in Americans' history, counting this one, you get to hear things you would never know otherwise. And PBS carried it all then, as we've said earlier, and people did get the message. Even Republicans changed their position. Both of you are too young to remember that after a while, a handful of Republicans in the Senate, Goldwater among them, Howard Baker among them, went down to see the president and said, Mr. Nixon, Mr. President, you can't stay. You've got to go. That was the power of those hearings. What we're saying to public broadcasting now, and some of my colleagues in public television keep saying, well, the media universe has changed. Well, of course it's changed. I know that. I've been a part of it, of that change. But what hasn't changed is the importance of people to watch what can happen when they can. And we're asking public television stations to put it on prime time, repeat it in prime time. Now, the response has been good from some and begs to differ from the others. I mean, WIDA, our major station in the Washington area, is carrying it live in the afternoons or mornings, live during the day, and repeated in the evenings. Wonderful. The small sister stations up in Vermont, they're carrying it the same way, and they're preempting their regular programming. I mean, it's always painful to disrupt your regular programming, but they're doing it, and they're putting the regular programs on their digital channel, their sub-channel, and they're running a crawl, what we call a crawl in the business, across the bottom of the screen that says you can see Antiques Roadshow, you can see Nova, you can see your regular programming on our sub-channel, but watch this one because this is what happened today. So, but here in New York, they explain that they think that their sub-channel, their digital sub-channel is enough. They're sticking with their regular programming. I think it's a lost opportunity to help 15 million people in this area see for themselves what they can't see during the day. But public television is not a top-down network. Stations have the autonomy to decide their own programming. Some are and some aren't. If you're living where they aren't, call them.
Well, back in the days of Watergate, there was no alternative like C-SPAN. See, I'm wondering if you're expecting a sharp rise in the viewership for C-SPAN, because C-SPAN usually not only broadcasts congressional events during the day, but then rebroadcast them in the evenings as well.
That's right. It's available in prime time on C-SPAN if you get C-SPAN. C-SPAN was created by a wonderful, inventive broadcaster in the early 70s. And you can go there now, but it's a small audience. It's like PBS's channels that are marginal. It's a small audience. Sometimes it's difficult to find, although it's there all the time. But PBS is the last remaining. And I'm not claiming for a moment that we'd get the audience we got in 1973 and 1974. Because you do have opportunities through internet, through satellite, through your devices to see it. But there's nothing like seeing it, in a sense, collectively.
Bill, you're a wordsmith. There was a letter written to the New York Times, a plea from 33 writers. Words matter. Stop using quid pro quo. The writers write, a plea from 33 writers. Please use language that will clarify the issues at hand. Please stop using the Latin phrase quid pro quo regarding the impeachment inquiry. Most people don't understand what it means. In any case, it doesn't refer only to a crime. Asking for a favor is not a criminal act. We frequently demand things from foreign countries before giving them aid, like asking them to improve their human rights record. Please use words that refer only to criminal behavior here. Use bribery or extortion to describe Mr. Trump's demand to President Zelensky of Ukraine, making it very clear this is a crime. The more we hear words that carry moral imputations, the more we understand the criminal nature of the act.
Well, language can be used to conceal as well as to reveal. And when it's being employed and subpoenaed to be used to defend a crime, you find a way to call a crime something other than a crime. I don't know. We don't know that what President Trump did regarding Ukraine is a crime in a strict legal sense. But it can well be a crime against the Constitution in its abuse of power. And look, if you listen to the testimony today and in ensuing days, if you read the transcripts, you will see that this is clearly a case. You know, circumstantial evidence is often the basis for a judgment in a legal trial. You will see that this president, in effect, offered to extort the Ukraine out of a difficult situation. And that is a crime against the Constitution if, in fact, it happens. And it's something I would not want a Democratic president to do, to use his power or her power one day to get a foreign government to interfere in our elections.
And then there's the question of whether this impeachment inquiry will expand with President Clinton, it started as an investigation into Whitewater, and it went on to become around a relationship he had. It'll be very interesting, and we're going to look at that in coming days, the issue of whether this will remain with Ukraine or go to issues like the death of children on the border in U.S. custody, the separation of families, and other issues. But we're going to deal with that in another on another day, because today we have to move on to a debate on what's happened in Bolivia. Bill Moyers, we want to thank you so much for being with us. Legendary broadcaster, president of the Schumann Media Center, former host of Moyers & Company on PBS, has won more than 30 Emmys. Democracy Now!, by the way, will be live streaming today's impeachment hearings beginning at 10 Eastern Time at democracynow.org. Come to us. When we come back, we look at the political crisis in Bolivia. President Evo Morales resigned over the weekend following what he described as a coup. A right-wing senator has now declared herself president. Stay with us.
Thank you both.
Elenca by Wara. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
We turn now to the deepening political crisis in Bolivia. On Sunday, Bolivian President Evo Morales resigned in what he described as a coup shortly after the Bolivian military took to the airwaves to call for his departure. On Tuesday, Morales flew to Mexico, where he has received asylum. On Tuesday night, right-wing Senator Jeanine Áñez declared herself Bolivia's new president, despite a lack of a quorum in the Congress to approve her ascension to that post.
Aquí se está frente a una sucesión presidencial.
We are facing here a presidential succession originating from the vacancy of the presidency of the state. Due to the definitive absence of the president and vice president, which means that according to the text and meaning of the Constitution, as president of the Chamber of Senators, I immediately assume the presidency of the state as foreseen in the constitutional order, and I commit myself to accept responsibility for all necessary measures to pacify the country.
Jeanine Áñez held a Bible when announcing her claim to the presidency, declaring the Bible returns to the presidential palace. Evo Morales' movement towards socialism party is refusing to recognize the new president, calling her claim illegal and decrying Morales' resignation as a military coup.
Last month, President Morales was re-elected for a fourth term in a race his opponent's claim was marred by fraud. He ran for a fourth term after contesting a referendum upholding term limits. Morales stepped down soon after accepting the Organization of American States' call for new elections. On Tuesday, Morales spoke in Mexico.
I also want to tell you, brothers and sisters, as long as I am alive, we will stay in politics. As long as I am alive, the fight will continue, and we're sure that the people of the world have all the rights to free themselves.
Morales' departure has sparked demonstrations and clashes across Bolivia. In La Paz Tuesday, his supporters took to the streets.
Remember, the opposition will never be able to govern as Evo Morales has done. It hurts us. Evo Morales was our leader. Viva Evo. We miss and love you, Evo. We have been left orphaned.
Well, for more, we host a debate on the political crisis in Bolivia. In La Paz, we're joined via Democracy Now! Video stream by Pablo Salom, former ambassador to the United Nations under President Evo Morales until 2011. He's former chief negotiator on climate change for Bolivia. And in Amherst, Massachusetts, we're joined by Kevin Young, assistant professor of history at University of Massachusetts Amherst. He's the author of Blood of the Earth, Resource, Nationalism, Revolution, and Empire in Bolivia. Young is also the editor of Making the Revolution, Histories of the Latin American Left. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Let's begin in Bolivia with Pablo Salón. Do you describe what happened as a coup?
I think it's very complicated to say it's a coup, because I think there was a popular rebellion, because this issue started in 2016 when Evo Morales didn't recognize the result of a referendum that said that he couldn't run for a new re-election. If he would have respected that referendum, he would have finished his third term as probably the best president in Bolivia. But he didn't do that. He forced that the Constitutional Tribunal did a statement saying that it was a human right to run for new elections. And then we have the elections of the 20th of October, where there was definitely fraud. We have so many evidences here, so many reports from different institutions, not only OAS saying it, that of course the population went to the streets. It was massive, and it has lasted for 20 days. So to say this is a coup d'etat planned by the White House, the right-wing forces, fascist forces, I think it's to make a caricature of what is really happening. Now, who's going to take advantage of this situation are going to be right-wing forces, is going to be the imperialism of North America. But who created this crisis, I think, was this addiction to power that Evo Morales and his party began to have during the last years.
I'd like to ask Kevin Young to deal with the same issue of whether this was a coup or not, and also to deal with the reality that the majority in the Congress is still of the is the political party of Evo Morales. So, to what degree can whoever becomes president be able to move forward with the political agenda, given the enormous strength still of the Evo Morales forces in the country?
A coup has a simple and straightforward definition. It's the unconstitutional removal of a sitting president before that president's term in office is up. And in the case of Bolivia, Evo Morales is the elected president. His term isn't due up until January 21st of 2020. And in this case, on Sunday, you have the lead commander of the Bolivian armed forces directly intervening in ordering Evo out of office. So that's a coup, and I think that's pretty straightforward. That shouldn't be controversial. What makes this coup particularly dangerous is that it is being supported by the most racist and reactionary elements in Bolivian society. Now, as well as by the United States. Now, all of that being said, the overall political situation in Bolivia is complex. All of the opposition is not the same. The opposition is not monolithic. There are opposition protesters who are much more progressive. Many indigenous groups, working class Bolivians, have become very disillusioned with Evo's government and have turned against it. So those voices are important to recognize. We shouldn't be painting the entire opposition with the same brush or insinuating that it's all some conspiracy by the United States. But at the same time, it is important to recognize as well that almost half of the Bolivian population voted for Evo Morales on October 20th. And whether you think that's 47%, as the government said, or maybe it's only 46 or 45%, the fact remains that almost half of Bolivians still supported Evo on October 20th. And those voices also need to be counted and recognized. They may have criticisms of the government. Many of them do, and I know some of them. But they're not supporting the coup because they fear that a right-wing government is really going to roll back some of the progressive gains that have been made in the last 13 years. And in an immediate sense, they're fearful of right-wing violence in the streets, which is happening and which is targeting particularly indigenous Bolivians. Now, what's going to happen with the Congress? Because despite the fact that many MAS legislators and officials have resigned, sometimes under threat of violence from the right, it is still true that a majority of the Congress is controlled by the MAS party. They have signaled, they have said that they are interested in finding a constitutional resolution to the crisis. Now, what exactly that's going to look like is still very unclear. It's not clear what new elections are going to look like or under what conditions they're going to be held. The MAS party is somewhat in disarray the last several days, so we really don't know what's going to happen at this point.
Well, Pablo Solong, I wanted to ask you about this this issue of Evo Morales had agreed as a result of the protests in the streets and the recommendation of the Organization of American States to hold new elections. So shouldn't the opposition have at least waited until his term was up, or until new elections were held before attempting to remove him completely? And also the issue of the military. The military on the one hand, said they were not going to intercede when the police officers began rebelling against the government, but then has interceded to join the police in now attempting to quell protests of Morales supporters.
Okay, so the first thing, Evo Morales called to new elections, or well, he said he was going to call to new elections, and he said he was going to change the electoral court, which meant that he agreed that the electoral court was involved in some case of fraud in the elections of the 20th of October. Because, Evo Morales didn't say, I called with elections and I respect this electoral court. No, I will change it. Because the evidence were too big. There was fraud. And of course, you had in the population, not the right-wing forces, the population said, watch out. You're saying that new elections with a new electoral court means that there was fraud. And fraud, it's something that you cannot accept. It's a crime. So you cannot say, okay, well, there was fraud. Now I'm going to call for a new elections. Nothing happened in Bolivia. Now I guarantee you that everything is going to be okay. It's impossible. And what happened then? Did the military do a coup and went out to the streets that day and forced Evo Morales? No, they said, we're not going to go out to the streets. The situation is terrible. People don't accept new elections after you are recognizing that there was fraud. That is what they said. And we suggest that you resign. And they didn't went out to the streets. And Evo Morales, why did he resign? My point of view is he resigned because he was not able to sustain this idea that the elections of the 20th of October were clean. And if they weren't clean, he was involved. Because you cannot do that fraud without the involvement of the government. So he resigned and he went to El Chapare because he thought that his resignation was going to create an uprising. Because it's true what the other person says. He has the support of more than 40% of the population. And he was expecting that there would be an uprising and then his sector would mobilize. But then what happened? There was that mobilization, but that mobilization was a mix of supporters of MAS, but also of vandalic groups that began to assault, burn. There were more than 70 buses of the public service system here in La Paz that were burned, drugstores. And it was the night of Sunday and Monday was terror in many cities. And the police stations began to be attacked by this combination of mass of supporters of the political party of the government, what's called mass, and these vandalic groups. So the police was not able to stop this. Neighborhoods began to organize to defend it themselves, not only in rich areas, but also in poor areas. At that moment, the police said, we need to have the support of the military to stop this violence, these vandalic groups. And you had the military coming out. I'm not in favor of that, but those are the facts. And then you had the military coming to the streets, and you have seen they have intervened, and in places where there are vandalic groups, huge violence. But for example, yesterday, you had a big mass demonstration from El Alto.
Can we bring in Kevin Young, your response to the description of Pablo Solong of what's been going on?
Sure. So I do want to briefly address the question of the October 20th elections. There is this widespread narrative that's been uncritically embraced in the media in the United States that there was a fraud in the October 20th elections. And that's largely based on the preliminary audit of the Organization of American States, which was released this past weekend, which does contain allegations of widespread irregularities. On the other hand, we have the authoritative report from the Center for Economic and Policy Research, which last week released a detailed study of the October 20th election and found that there was no evidence of fraud, or at least if there were irregularities, there was no evidence that they were decisive in determining the outcome. Now, is it possible that there were irregularities? Absolutely. I'm not denying that. But as you said, Juan, on November 10th, earlier in the day, Evo Morales actually offered to hold new elections as a major concession to the protesters. He even offered to replace the entire electoral monitoring body. And I don't see that. I disagree with Pablo here. I don't see that as necessarily an admission of fraud. I see it more as a concession that was intended to keep the peace. But the fact is that the opposition, most of them didn't want new elections because they doubted that they could beat Evo at the ballot boxes. They wanted a coup, and that's exactly when the military steps in and orders Evo to leave. Now, I agree with Pablo that the situation on the streets is extremely concerning. There's violence being committed not only by the right, but also by many Mas supporters who are justly terrified of what's going to happen. So the situation is complex. It shouldn't be reduced to simple good versus bad or left versus right. But that doesn't change the fact that this was a coup. It's a complex situation, and it's a coup with some popular support, but it's still a coup.
Pablo Solong, are you concerned about, the woman who's just declared herself president, saying she's bringing the Bible back into government? Opposition protesters kidnapping Mayor Patricia Arce, the mayor loyal to Morales, forcibly cutting her hair, dousing her with red paint, parading her through the streets. And then you have, for example, the Luis Fernando Camacho, who is the far-right multimillionaire who arose, many say, out of fascist movements in Bolivia, saying Pachamama will never return to the palace. Bolivia belongs to Christ.
Well, first, let me answer. You're not right. Before the OAS, we had here in Bolivia reports. We were able to see different reports from the voting places where they changed signatures, they changed figures, numbers. OAS didn't create this because of them. They had to see the evidence that we have here, and you have other reports before the OAS report. The second thing,
Pablo, we have 30 seconds.
Excuse me. I mean, because if you say it is a coup means the military went out to the streets. Why did Evo Morales, when Evo Morales resigned, said this is a coup from the police and the civil
he didn't want to mention the military. Now, going to your question.
We're going to have to go to that question in part 2 of this discussion. I want to thank Pablo Salón, former ambassador to the UN under President Evo Morales until 2011, and Kevin Young, professor at University of Massachusetts Amherst. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.